The sand compressed as Gaara closed his hand, intent on crushing the ninja inside, and a look of unholy glee decorated the Suna Jinchuriki's face for a moment. Then the sand exploded outward in a spiral, spraying over the stadium floor, revealing Naruto, his coat shredded and his bone metal extruded. The row of spikes along his spine had edges to them now, and from his elbows emerged a blade each, 4 inches long, of the material that now made up his skeleton, and the spikes from his knees and shoulder blades were also edged, more like knives than spikes. He'd retracted his claws and plated over his knuckles, and every bone in his body, including those that stuck out of it, hummed with barely contained power as he held above his head twin balls of blue spiraling chakra, visible to any who looked, driving back the sand in an absolutely impossible, yet impressively incontrovertible manner. Jiraiya collapsed back into his seat, breathing a sigh of relief. "Forgot that I taught him that," he muttered, making himself the immediate target of his friend and his sensei. "You taught him the Rasengan," Tsunade gritted out between her teeth, "and you, what was it again, forgot that you had? Was that because you knew I'd tear you a new one if you'd told me?" Jiraiya seemed surprised. "You'd have stopped at one? Maybe I should have told you then." Tsunade was still overjoyed that Naruto was alive, so she didn't hit the perverted Sannin too hard, just enough that he cratered the wall behind them. All across the stands, and around the stadium there were people who saw this as a miracle. Konohamaru and his friends, Hiyashi and Hanabi, Team 7, Team 10, Team 9. The list was much bigger than anyone could imagine. Orochimaru couldn't understand it. How did the child do this? He needed to give the signal soon, but with the other Sannin nearby. The Sound 4 were in place, even if he still didn't know where the Uchiha was. Down in the stadium, Gaara stared, while in the back of his mind, Shukaku the Ichibi ranted. The sand burial hadn't killed the boy, why not? If he was that strong, his blood would be perfect to feed to Mother, but if he was that strong, how was Gaara supposed to get to the blood? Naruto breathed deep as everyone stared, his mind darting back to when he'd asked Jiraiya what he could teach him, and Jiraiya had shown him his first Rasengan. A jutsu of the Yondaime Hokage's invention, albeit an incomplete one. Now he was glad he had. His bone metal may have been able to take the pressure Gaara's sand burial subjected him to, but the rest of him wasn't quite so sturdy. As the sand had closed around him, Naruto had poured his chakra into his bones, along with the wind and lightning elements, creating a resonance that agitated the sand, keeping it soft around himself. Not that he thought of it in those terms exactly, of course, and had then forced not one, but 2 Rasengan into existence. Now, as the crowd came to its feet roaring with excitement, Naruto again extended his claws, letting the plating on his knuckles draw back into his skeleton, absorbing the Rasengan into them as they pierced each, blending the destructive jutsu with the wind and lightning already present. The result was a constantly shifting corona of blue chakra around the claws, and as Naruto attacked, he roared out the new move's name, Rasenjutsu. Uzumaki no Sume, Claws of the Maelstrom. Gaara had not been scared like this before. No one lived when he buried them. Mother always got her blood, but this one was different. This boy, a year younger than he, had survived. He did not show fear like everyone else did, he did not hate, and Gaara had not killed him. That was impossible. It kept coming back to that. The monster inside him wanted to kill and to murder and slaughter, while Gaara just wanted to run away. Placing his hands before him as Naruto charged, Gaara enacted the only genjutsu he'd ever been taught. Forced sleep jutsu. As Gaara toppled over, Orochimaru acted, smoke bombs concealing the cage's box with massive clouds, a huge distraction, and the signal to begin his invasion. His agents enacted their jutsu. Kabuto went to snatch his target. The Sound 4 threw aside their disguises and leapt to their places, ready to throw up the barrier, and chaos reigned all over. Shukaku emerged at once, a massive outpouring of sand, yellow chakra and malice, and Naruto paused as the massive monster took form, lifting Gaara up and away, barely holding his maelstrom claws technique in place. He snarled and slashed at the Biju's face before it was beyond his reach, to incredible effect as the monster dropped its container and its face seemingly exploded from the discharge of the jutsu. The pain that rocketed through Naruto, a bone-deep, searing agony, told the young shinobi that this jutsu had a terrible cost. If he didn't heal like he did, that would likely have destroyed his chakra coils for good. Even now, as Naruto felt his bone metal retreat back into his flesh, he had to mend, but he didn't have time, and that thing's face was already reforming as the sand poured into place. On the rooftop of the stadium, Orochimaru held the Hokage by the neck as a second explosion destroyed the now obscured cage's box, and as the smoke billowed across the roof behind him, his elite Sound 4 took up positions at the corners of the roof and raised the barrier as he'd instructed, each including a second, smaller barrier to protect them from anyone inside the first. This was marvelous, today was finally going right. And then Sarutobi Hiruzen dispersed in a burst of white smoke as three figures emerged from the cloud of smoke that was even now rapidly dissipating. Hiruzen stood at the front in his black silk and steel battle armor, while Jiraiya took the left flank and Tsunade the right, and the renegade Sannin ground his teeth together. He'd been hoping to play with Sarutobi-sensei a little, but these two changed the whole game completely. His hands began to make the signs for a jutsu he'd hoped to use later, and he hissed the technique's name, Edo Tensei, Impure Resurrection. He didn't expect what happened next. As the first coffin appeared, Tsunade saw the writing on it and was right there, shattering it with her chakra-enhanced strength before it could fully manifest, even as Jiraiya did the same thing to the second with a Rasengan. The third coffin, Sarutobi began to act, but paused when Jiraiya laughed at the name on the front. Even as the coffin opened, the other two Sannin turned to Orochimaru. That was a big mistake, Orochimaru gloated. The fourth Hokage, the greatest Hokage. He paused as the sacrifice tumbled out of the coffin unharmed. What? The look of shock on his face as his perfect jutsu failed had him enough off balance that Jiraiya had the time to explain. You want to know how it failed? It wasn't a question. All I can tell you is that the Shinigami doesn't like those who try to steal from him, and Minato's soul was sealed inside the Shinigami's stomach. If you had summoned him, you would also have brought the Shinigami, but the Shinigami would not have been bound to your will, and might have been a little upset. The Suna ninja beyond the walls received the signal and the auto summoners among them began the summoning. In short order, 5 massive vipers were slithering towards Konoha's defenses, with the armies of Suna and Otto behind them. The hidden infiltrators sprang into action at the signal, starting to slam out a forced sleep genjutsu, and that's where things began to go downhill. Without someone on the inside to modify the records, as Kabuto could have if he'd managed to pass undetected, they'd been spotted right away, and each had been tagged by a particular Anbu. As they began their hand seals, one by one they were hit hard, and taken down, as they focused on the targets that would have crippled Konoha's recovery and left the village with no one to turn to, except for the one person not present. Shimura Danzo, Hyuga Hiyoshi's Byakugan had been active at the time that the would-be assassin made his move, as had Hanabi's, so the genjutsu would have had no effect on them, but he was surprised when a man in a Kumo headband struck down the apparent Anbu who was performing it, to the shock of the 3 Kumo students with him. Sighing, the Jonin sensei of the Kumo team snarled at them. I'll explain later, and give you all a choice, he said in the low voice he often used when something mattered. Until then, defend the leaf, especially the Hyuga. I know about the secret mission Raikage Baka gave you, but bear in mind he is not here, I am, and so are you. The gray, crane-embroidered cloak that whirled about the man's shoulders told Hiyoshi everything he needed to know of this man's identity, even as he raced away to battle. Ishiguma Daikenshi stood in the courtyard of the hospital, with his daughter on one flank and Koshi on the other. The thought that Otome was actually related to that boy who defeated her, forcing her to recklessly fuel the huge amounts of chakra that the Iron Bear required and accidentally giving her an off switch for her Kekkei Genkei, was nothing short of ludicrous. Far too unbelievable to be anything but the truth. As the Otto and Suna infiltrators arrived, he made a choice. Never liked Iwa Winters anyway, he said, taking the same fighting stance he'd drilled into his daughter. Maybe I'll get a chance to spar with that Maeda guy. These invaders would never realize what hit them. Naruto knew a bit about genjutsu, thanks to Kurenai-sensei. He was no great shakes at it himself, but penetrating them, with his enhanced senses it was far easier to notice them, as almost no one ever thought to do anything about the sense of smell, and when they did, they were limited by their own senses. But the self-enforced sleep that Gaara had used was a problem. Even as new as he was to Fuinjutsu, he could tell that Gaara's seal was faulty, that it leaked far too much of the Ichibi's emotions into its host. There were only 3 ways to win this. The first was unpleasant: kill the host. If he had to, he could, but Gaara had probably had as much choice in this matter as Naruto had, so that was a last resort. Especially as it wouldn't immediately disperse Shukaku. The second option would be to fix the seal, but Naruto had no idea where to begin with that. The third option was to somehow wake up the host, since he apparently had to be asleep to release the monster. The blonde Jinchuriki knew of 3 ways to dispel a genjutsu, too. Strange how things seemed to happen that way at times, he mused. Agitation of the chakra would work, but it looked like most of his chakra was in the monster. That could take a while. Taking down the chakra anchors in a pulse of chakra was a good one, especially for wide-area genjutsu, and Naruto was able to shred those over a much bigger area than anyone else could have dreamed of. Then there was the third way, the way he felt would work best. Physical pain. Naruto drew back his fist and broke Gaara's trance, and his nose. The scream of despair as the Ichibi scattered caused everyone in the stadium to flinch, even as Gaara's siblings appeared beside him, ready, but certainly not eager to fight Naruto, even as the redhead stared at the blood pouring down his face into his hands. His own blood, that was meant to be on the inside. He looked up at the younger, saner Jinchuriki and asked, why? A soft flare, just a touch of the red chakra, and Naruto turned away. Because I know, Naruto said as his eyes searched the stands for Hinata, and found her just as the Suna Jonin, Baki, was hammered into the wall by her gentle storm. If it weren't for her, he pointed her out, then we wouldn't be having this talk. Because Konohagakure no Sato would have been the first thing destroyed. But she is here, so I am here, and I have found those precious to me, because I am precious to them. With that, Naruto was gone in a blur, grabbing his scroll as he disappeared, reappearing where Hinata and Shino were as he swallowed a soldier pill, and then all 3 were away. Sasuke glared at the white-haired man who had him in his grip. Kabuto's mask had fallen away when he'd grabbed Sasuke, and the scalpel held to his throat was a threat that Kakashi couldn't ignore. As the renegade medic pressed it against the Uchiha boy's throat, the curse mark hissed its terrible promises, and Sasuke was, considering his situation, hard-pressed to resist the blandishments. He tensed, ready to move at his sensei's word, when a kunai was jammed into the older genin's knee from the side and twisted so the very bones themselves would hold it in place by a girl who had seemed to be sleeping, a girl with pink hair, and as Kabuto flinched, the pressure was off Sasuke's neck, and he substituted with a chair using Kawarimi, wincing as the curse mark tried to pour the black chakra into the jutsu. Sakura had just struck and jumped back as Kabuto swiped, barely slicing at her dress, as the silk parted, dropping the front flap to the ground. But it was just the silk. A sudden hiss drew the renegade ninja's eyes to the kunai, and the exploding tag on it, with barely enough time to realize he could not avoid this. The explosion blew his leg to shreds. Alone against the old man, Orochimaru might have won. Against either of the other Sannin the fight would have been harder, but he'd have managed. Against all 3, he didn't stand a chance, and that barrier kept him in as much as it kept others out. Twisting away from Tsunade's assaults while avoiding Jiraiya's and Sarutobi Sensei's ninjutsu assaults was wearing him down faster than it was them, as he had to stay 3 times as active as they did, and his physical stamina was beginning to falter. To make matters worse, if he did have his followers drop the barrier, he'd gain 4 allies, but his enemies would gain so many more. The Anbu around the barrier were looking hard for a way through, and drawing a blank, as Team 8 and their sensei appeared on the edge of the roof. What progress? The Jonin sensei asked. None, the Anbu captain spat, his rabbit-shaped mask muffling his vitriol. The barrier prevents the passage of both chakra and physical objects by destroying them, and even continues underneath the tiles. He stomped on the roof in explanation. In theory, there's a gap, but we can't take advantage of it. He paused as Naruto lifted the bright blue orb of a Rasengan, even as he shook the sand out of his sandals. I said that won't work. Naruto's grin had him halt in his tracks. Oh, this isn't for the barrier, the genin said, and slammed the destructive jutsu into the roof by the barrier's corner. The massive detonation of chakra undermined the roof, and it collapsed out and away from the barrier, carrying with it the youths who were maintaining the barrier at this corner, who looked like Siamese twins, and panicked as they passed through the very deadly barrier they were holding in place. The death of Yukon, Sakin was quick and clean, and the barrier fell. As the Auto elites were quickly swarmed under by Anbu, Orochimaru grimaced. This was not working. He had to get away and formulate a new strategy. As he shunned Shinda away, shedding his skin as a distraction and decoy, he vowed again that Konoha would fall. Hiruzen looked around as the reports came in. It was a depressing picture. I need messengers, guards for the civilians, and something to stop those blasted snake summons, he snarled once the reports came in. Team 8 glanced at each other and smiled. If the Anbu, Jonin and other shinobi can hold out, we have those covered, Hinata said, and as one, the three genin swung their scrolls from their backs. Jiraiya recognized the seals on the summons contracts he'd helped create, but he didn't know what had agreed to be bound to them, only the terms of that binding. The third one, that was the Mantis Ridge contract. There were no finer guards among the summons than they. Aburame Shino, bearer of the Mantis Ridge contract. We can handle the need for guards for the civilian bunkers. Hyuga Hinata, bearer of the Squirrel Hollow contract. No finer messengers exist. Naruto surprised them, as most would expect him to summon toads, like Jiraiya, or foxes, like his prisoner. However, the boy had discovered that the seal on his belly prevented him from connecting to any foxes in such a manner, so he'd gone a little further afield for his summons. Uzumaki Naruto, bearer of the Mongoose Hill contract. Leave the snakes to us. The Hokage nodded. Then you know what to do. Go do it. As the three teens began their summoning, Hiruzen shook his head, and waved Tsunade over. I'm getting too old for this, he complained. I need you to succeed me. The invasion was done, a total failure. The summoned vipers had reached the wall to find a young man and twice their own number of mongoose summons waiting for them. With intact walls and ready defenses, a continued attack was suicidal. As the Auto Nin started to abandon the Suna to their fate, a wave of surrenders began. With the squirrels as messengers, coordination was good, and the Mantis Guards, along with the shinobi, made certain of the safety of the civilians. Stalking into his camp, Orochimaru wondered what exactly had gone wrong, where had he made his mistake, and he remembered a day, long ago, when Kabuto had sent him a boy who healed rapidly, to experiment on. His rage focused to a pinpoint hatred. When Danzo and his root soldiers emerged from his hidden base, he had not expected Hiruzen and the Anbu to be waiting for him. Shimura Danzo, you are hereby under arrest for treason, to be exact, concealing resources and hindering the operations of Konoha Shinobi in a time of war, Hiruzen announced. Danzo took refuge in his words, sweeping out with his stolen eye. No such state of war was declared. It seemed reasonable, until Hyuga Hiyashi struck several of Danzu's tenketsu, shutting off the flow of chakra to Danzu's crippled eye and arm, and his genjutsu fell apart. An invasion by foreign shinobi obviates the need for such a declaration, absent invitations and authorizations from the Hokage. And they didn't have anything like that, Hiruzen said, turning to Ibiki. He's high risk. Keep his chakra sealed, and his movements restricted. No visitors without the signature of the Hokage. The genin from the exams were assembled in the stadium. The prisoners from Suna had been interrogated, and those who actually had some authority had been negotiated with. Jiraiya had looked at the Suna Jinchuriki's seal, and modified it, making it more secure against the Biju's presence. The only way the insane demon could influence Gaara now was if he let it. They were presented to the Sandaime Hokage, who had gone over the reports and information from the exams, as well as the battle afterwards. Suna's case had, by their own medical experts' analysis, been dead for over 3 months before they'd found his body, so Orochimaru had tricked them, and Hiruzen did not press them over much for reparations, save for a free hand today. The Kumo group were looking somewhat lost without their sensei, and the Iwa team had a glaring absence. Those who'd been in the hospital for various reasons were present as well, and now the Hokage was passing his judgment. It has been decided as part of the negotiations and peace settlements, that none of the Suna Genin here today shall be promoted to Chunin at this time. Instead, they will be returned to their home under escort. They are forbidden entry to Hai no Kuni for a period of 2 years. Of the other participants, we have come to our decisions. First, we raise Kyoseki Koshi to the rank of Chunin, the only shinobi from beyond Konoha to achieve that result today. Next, from Konoha itself, we promote Aburame Shino, Hyuga Hinata, Nara Shikamaru and Uzumaki Naruto. Congratulations to all of you. Hiruzen took a deep breath. Further, I take the chance on this occasion to step down and allow my successor, the Godem Hokage, to take my place. It seems I shall be known as the only Kage to ever retire, twice. He reached up and removed his hat. Senju Tsunade, I give you this burden, and the full authority therein, to guard our precious home, and the even more precious people who make it so. As the female Sanin accepted the hat, she muttered through gritted teeth. You do remember I only agreed with this because you threatened to give the job to Jiraiya? Rumors flew through the land of the Chunin exams in Konoha, and the invasion. As more and more heard it and passed it on, it grew, as such stories do. In Iwa, a nervous Koshi, who had been unwilling to leave his family, had been carefully interrogated about why he was the only one from Iwa to be promoted, and the only member of his team to return at all. To say the Tsuchikage was not pleased by the results would have been an understatement, but he could hardly punish the only Chunin promoted by the Konoha judges. At least he wasn't alone. In Kumogakure no Sato, a very upset Reikage was left to glare at the hole in his wall that he'd thrown the messenger through. A hole that had not been there before the messenger was thrown. The news that a promising team of genin had defected, hardly because of that secret mission to acquire the Byakugan, but largely because the loyal Jonin sensei he'd handpicked to guard the shinobi he'd had raised from abducted children, had actually been a deep cover spy and infiltrator. He was furious. Send me the Jinchuriki teams, he barked out. I have a job for them. Kurenai looked at the stack of Ryo she'd won. She'd forgotten about this bet, placed to show her confidence in her team. She'd forgotten the bookie quoting her 1,000-to-1 odds, and now that she had it, what was she going to do with 50,000 Ryo? Hyuga Hiyashi looked at the paperwork he'd been filling out, and nodded. He didn't like it, but it was the only way to do this. If he delayed it too long, certain interfering people might take it into their heads to try again. He signed the papers and applied his seal and infused it with his chakra signature. 2 weeks, it was not a long time, but perhaps it would be enough. Kabuto opened his eyes, and found himself secured to a hospital bed. He could feel the restraints on his arms and his left leg, the fools. He idly wondered why they hadn't bound the other leg as he began to channel his chakra scalpels to the free limb, only to realize it wasn't there. A tall scarred figure entered the room. Morino Ibiki, I think you might have a few things we're interested in knowing, Yakushi Kabuto, he said slowly, as the white-haired ninja's stomach sank. And trust me, you will want to share them with us. Team 8, including their now wealthy sensei, sat on the top of the Hokage monument, on the 4th Hokage's head, watching as stoneworkers and sculptors began to measure and sketch to begin work on the next face to decorate this mountain. They were all alive, they were all Chunin, and life was good. Naruto held Hinata close, and looked around as the sun set over Konoha, and daydreamed of the challenges of tomorrow. After all, Orochimaru was still out there, and he was hardly the only person or group that had to be dealt with, but for now. Hiyashi cleared his throat, attracting the attention of the new Chunin and their sensei, nodding to the latter, who grinned as her students approached the head of the Hyuga clan. When he spoke, Hiyashi didn't beat around the bush. Naruto's answer echoed across the village. The wedding is in how long? Naruto was intimidated, almost scared, of the reactions of many of the citizens of Konoha in the aftermath of the Chunin exams. As one of the handful of promotions for this event, he'd expected to be in the limelight, but at some deep, terrified level, He was certain that people would believe he'd cheated somehow, that he'd used the demon fox within him to take the title from someone more deserving. However, aside from some of Sasuke's more rabid fangirls, whose number no longer included Sakura or Ino, for example, the people around the town were actually treating him well. As this was a major attitude change for them, he kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Naruto took note of the time and hurried along. Hinata was doing some shopping with Ino, Sakura and Tenten this morning, while he had been summoned to see the Godem Hokage and her most prominent advisor, the former Sandaime, before he had to meet his Hinataheim for some mysterious shopping of his own. As he raced toward the Hokage tower over the rooftops, he wondered why he was needed. Ishiguma Daikenshi had always hated his first name, and the strict laws of Iwa had caused his adoption of Otome to be an informal thing, rather than anything on paper. Now he sat here in this waiting room as Otome read from a scroll on the Hyaku Hoseki traits and bloodline, wondering how impressive this clan head for her family would be. When the new Chunin that Otome had faced in the stadium entered and strode up to the desk, Otome put down her scroll and watched him. She couldn't see any resemblance between the two of them, and surely what little she'd heard about him had to be exaggerated. But then, he did manage to shut down her Kekkei Genkei, or more accurately, force her to shut it down. She owed him something for that, so perhaps she could give him the benefit of the doubt. The boy was passed in to see the Hokage, both the old one and the new, and Ishiguma grunted in resignation. He didn't quite see why a freshly minted Chunin, even one as formidable as that one, was just allowed to waltz in. He must have missed the boy leaving, he assumed, when the dark-haired girl with the pig informed him that the Hokage would see them now. As the two former Iwa nin entered, they saw that they had not missed the Chunin's exit. He was still here. The Sandaime sat in a comfortable chair to one side and behind the desk, while the Godem, a mature woman, late 30s, maybe, rose from her own. The two available chairs looked comfortable, but since the boy was standing, so would they. Tsunade acknowledged the two with a nod. Ishiguma-san, Otome-san, welcome. I believe everyone here at least knows of each other, but for completeness, allow me the introductions. She gestured to each person as she named them. I am Senju Tsunade, the Godem Hokage, known as the Queen of Slugs and Elixirs in some circles, and one of the Sannin. This is my advisor, Sarutobi Hiruzen, the former Sandaime Hokage, now retired once again, also known variously as the Professor and the God of Shinobi. Finally we have Uzumaki Naruto, our latest Chunin, and head of the Uzumaki clan, of which the Hyaku Hoseki blood was one of 3 cadet lines. As the information sank in, Ishiguma had a blistering realization hit him full force. They weren't here so Otome could be adopted. She already was part of the clan by blood. They were here so she could adopt him. Wait a moment, please, he said, and thought furiously. If I am correct, he continued after a few moments, then you wish to adopt me into this clan, yes? I am uncertain what I can offer you. Are you certain you wish to do this? Naruto rose and bowed. Once things had been explained to him, that this girl was family, he'd known exactly what was needed. Ishiguma-san, everyone has been tiptoeing around this issue, but what you say is true. As Otome is part of the Uzumaki by blood, and sees you as her father, then it makes sense that you also join the clan. All you need to offer is to keep being her dad. But before you accept, there is information you must both be made aware of. 2 things actually. Naruto's words had their attention now. Ishiguma and Otome from curiosity as to what might change their minds, and Hiruzen and Tsunade from what information the boy had come across besides being the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki. The first piece of information, Naruto said, is that I am the prison of the Kyuubi no Yoko. The second, is that my father caused that scar. Hiruzen was speechless, and Tsunade wasn't much better. Otome gaped for a while, switching her stare back and forth from her father to her cousin? Kinsman? She didn't know which term was best. Ishiguma on the other hand was scrutinizing the Chunin, little more than a boy. There were similarities, yes. Not a perfect match, with enough of his mother in him. His mother, she had to be that Uzumaki Kushina, the Crimson Blade, that was feared by both Iwa and Kumo. Still, he had to be sure. Who told you this? He asked. No one, Naruto replied. I figured it out quite a while ago, and it was independently confirmed by those with reason to know. Besides, if the Hokage monument was in color, the whole village would have seen it long ago. Hinata stood in the center of the group as she quietly explained why she needed their help. And so, you see, I'll be marrying Naru-kun in 2 weeks' time. I need your help. She bowed a little. My father has made arrangements for the formal kimono, but I need advice and assistance in other ways. Kurenai-sensei has agreed to stand in for my mother, and Tenten nodded. You need your attendance, but can't figure out how to ask. Hinata blushed a little, embarrassed, but nodded. I don't want to seem arrogant, or like I think I'm above you or anything. It's just, this is important to me. It's for Naru-kun. Ino shook her head. It's your big day too, Hinata, she pointed out. So keep that in mind, alright? Now, let's start with the shopping. Lingerie first, that's over there. The whole tale had taken a while to tell. Otome had been shocked, and tears had actually come to her eyes. She'd been unable to meaningfully touch people, but she'd at least had her father. Naruto's closest contact as a child had been the Hokage, a busy man who couldn't devote all his time to looking out for the boy, and then the abduction, the changes the experiments caused, the pain from those, the alienation. She was sure that a lesser person would have given up long ago. And this council, about this CRA. They can't force it on someone, can they? The Hokage nodded. That's why I consider it a particularly vile piece of work. I don't have quite the support I need to overthrow it and remove it yet. Removing Danzo helped, but I really need another seat from the council to get it. A seat that Naruto isn't old enough to vote. Ishiguma's smile was not something one would like to see in a dark alley. It was almost feral, whereas I, should the head of my clan so choose, can stand as proxy. That's how I can repay him. Now, how do we do this? Shino passed the invitation to his parents, and as their eyebrows rose, he smiled. Few people invited the Aburame to grand occasions such as this wedding, but here it was in some of the neatest calligraphy they'd seen. Shibi turned to his son. You believe we should go? Shino nodded. They are my teammates. They wish to share this day with my family. I doubt that either will be able to pay attention to anyone else, but we will be seen to be there. It is good for our clan, and I get to support my best friends outside my colonies. The conclusion is inescapable. In Sanagakure no Sato, Tamari and Kankuro peered into their brother's room. That horrible grating noise like sawing logs had dragged them through the house to find Gaara, fearing some new torture for some poor soul. But there he lay, eyes shut, the terrible noise emerging from his sleeping form as he snored. Naruto stood on the bridge where he was to meet Hinata. He was early, but he had things to think on. Ishiguma and Otome had insisted on taking the clan name as their own, so now he had a cousin and uncle, and fitting family into his life was new. He felt disoriented, as though everything were twisted to the side, and was fighting to understand how these complete strangers could feel so indebted to him as to swear the kind of fealty they'd offered as head of the Uzumaki clan. The first thing he'd stated was a bald, Uzumaki aren't sealed against their own choice. At which point the newly named Uzumaki Ishiguma smiled even wider. He smiled. That was 2 more people for the groom's side of the ceremony now. There was a bright side to it, after all. There was, he decided, a fate worse than death. Neji looked on as Naruto was measured and fitted for the formal kimono by Kujaku Dansei. This was it. The formerly fate-obsessed boy, he acknowledged himself that the way he'd behaved towards his family was not the attitude of a man. Stared at the young man. There was no way to deny Naruto that title, with a wry self-deprecating smile. The elders still had some holdouts over this matter, but by and large, Uzumaki had overcome their objections with the events of the Chunin exams. It was ironic that one of Naruto's most fervent supporters was once the same man who'd called for his death for, how did he put it again? Oh, yes, corrupting the heiress and weakening her resolve and abilities. Of course, said, weak girl, was well on the way to becoming the strongest kunoichi of her generation. Obviously it took more than just having the Byakugan to give someone clear sight. The 3 young Kumo genin looked around at the house they'd found themselves in. It was decorated with a definite crane motif. A portrait in particular caught their attention as they waited for the person they were supposed to meet. He looked somewhat like their sensei, but older, the hair almost silver. As they looked, a familiar voice spoke up behind them. "My great-grandfather, Suru Tetsu." Turning, they found the familiar features of their sensei, but in clothes they'd never seen before. The crane motif was extended here, and the silver-trimmed blue of his clothes fit him in a way the gray and black he'd worn in Kumo never had. He seemed happier, more comfortable, and for a moment they couldn't figure out why. Then the realization struck. He was home. At his invitation, they made themselves comfortable. "Let's start at the beginning, shall we?" he asked, and continued as they nodded. A bit under a decade ago, Kumo's current Reikage came to power, and decided that the way to make Kumo stronger was to take in the people of other nations. An admirable goal on paper, but his method of applying the principle was less so. He started by abducting children from other villages, usually the smaller villages, but then he saw the power in the bloodlines that Kiri was persecuting, and started expanding his plans. After successfully abducting children from other nations under the guise of diplomatic relations, he set his sights on the Byakugan. "At that time I was simply Suru Shikinshi, a name I have once again taken, and when the main plan failed he began to make noises of war to claim the body of the killer. The Hyuga instead gave him the body of the killer's twin, but I realized that this would not satisfy him. So I went to Hokage-sama with a plan, to infiltrate Kumo, and investigate these things. With the distraction caused by the detonation of the explosive tags I left all over that body. And so began the life of Sagigiso." Sakura looked at the targets, huffing as her body caught up to her actions. Only 2/3 of her kunai had struck the mark, and that was simply not good enough. She glanced at the shadows. There was still time for another round, and she was improving faster than she'd thought she would. Maybe if she asked Sasuke for some tips? He was the best at this back in the academy, after all, and it wouldn't put any strain on his chakra. If he felt useful, perhaps that would help. He just seemed so depressed lately. Naruto stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching with Hinata beside him as their shadow clones fought a huge battle. To be fair, they had only created 5 clones each, and as the last dispelled and they both gained the memories they sighed and leaned against each other. "Another draw," Naruto said. His Hinata Haim nodded. He had the masses of chakra, she had the precision and efficiency. It balanced out, but they weren't able to determine who would have won that last fight in the exams. Annoying, but still, they had wondered. The past week had been hectic, and now there was nothing left but the waiting. Hinata was getting fed up with the waiting, impatient to be able to call herself Naru-kun's wife. They knew very well why Kurenai-sensei was sleeping so near them, and the only hiccup in the whole 2 weeks would be the night just before the actual ceremony. By tradition, she had to take a ritual bath to purify herself, a washing away of the old life so she was ready for the new, and could not spend that night with her intended. The two were worried that their nightmares would return and had voiced their concerns on such. Their weekly therapy sessions with the Yamanakas were going well, according to those two, although Naruto had overheard one of Inoichi's comments to his wife. "How that boy has gone through all that and not broken, I'll never know. I'm surprised that Konoha is still here sometimes, what with all that has been done to him." Haruno Mebuki had been up all night, scouring the archives for some way to overturn the ruling of the Kyuubi brat's promotion, and enact the CRA. Her daughter would be perfect, once she got over the whole thing with that Uchiha. But why was there a nagging feeling at the back of her mind that this was wrong? Brushing aside the tiny voice that was protesting this set of actions, she strode into the council chamber. The Godem Hokage had relieved the elders Homura and Kaharu of their burdens, despite their protests, and installed the former Sandame in their place. Between that and Danzu's incarceration, it resulted in a tied vote, but one that Mebuki was certain she could swing in the right direction with this little piece of legislation. She frowned as she passed the large man with the scar and the ruby eye in a kimono, black with orange trim with the Uzumaki spirals on the shoulders and back, as well as over the heart. A configuration that only Uzumaki could wear. Since when was the stone bear an Uzumaki? As the counselor for the clanless Shinobi took her seat, The Godem took one look at the proposed agenda for today's meeting, snorted, and tore the inch-thick pile of paperwork in half. There was polite applause from a number of the Shinobi clans. Today's agenda has not been sent to my office for confirmation, Tsunade began, her voice daring them to interrupt and find out why that was a bad idea. No one did. So today runs to my agenda. Item 1. The Uzumaki clan has accepted one Uzumaki Otome into their ranks, and has extended a clan adoption to her father by choice, Uzumaki Ishiguma. Citing his age and lack of experience in dealing with politics, Uzumaki Naruto has given his proxy to his newly adopted uncle. This is not a request, as the clan's business is just that, it is a notification. As a further notice, with this expansion, Uzumaki Naruto is no longer the last male of his clan, and thus the CRA no longer applies. Mebuki was stunned, and the voice in the back of her head got louder and started cheering. With difficulty she pushed it back, but now she felt a migraine starting. Tsunade's voice broke through the pain. Item 2 is the abolishment of the abomination known as the Clan Restoration Act. It is nothing less than legalized slavery, and I will have nothing like it in my Konoha. Tsunade's vehemence on the subject was infectious. Ishiguma voted with the other shinobi clans as the Hokage wished, and smiled a promise at the civilian council, who recalled that he had a daughter who this law could have applied to, and several of them also voted for the abolishment. Those who did, however, winced with pain as headaches spontaneously manifested, bad ones. Tsunade noticed. Until certain issues can be ironed out, she announced, I will not be convening the council. Until then, you can all rest easy. Dismissed. After they'd left, she turned to Shizune. Get word to Jiraiya, she said, and quietly make sure that I'm the one to do the checkups on the counselor's medicals. And bump up those medicals to just after the wedding. I looked at the border. He was certain this was a bad idea, but the Raikage gave the orders. A team of 3 Chunin under a Jonin was the standard team for an assassination, but for Konoha? He'd seen some of the reports that had been sent back by Kumo agents. One of their genin, admittedly, he was made Chunin afterwards, but at the time he'd still been a genin, had stopped a Biju. He shook his head. There were times he thought his dad had to be going senile. This felt like one of them. He scrutinized his team as he drew a deep breath. There was B. Killer B as he styled himself. He was I's little brother, adopted by the Raikage, whose imagination when it came to names seemed to be sorely lacking. B was the Jinchuriki to the Hachibi, a monstrous blend of octopus and ox. An oxtopus as B himself had put it once. It had taken 12 straight hours of classical music to convince Killer B that such a nickname for one of the most powerful things on the planet was not respectful. Somewhere along the way, the youth had become addicted to rap, although until he figured out how to properly balance the rhythm and rhyme schemes, it should be pronounced with an invisible C at the start. Then there was Ni Yugito. She'd always been an independent sort, paying barely a lick of attention to authority. That might have been the influence of the Nibi no Nekomata inside her, but it could have some other cause, too. The only reason she and B were on the same team was because it was easier to keep an eye on them that way. The girl always wore gloves, rumor said to stop her, death touch, from killing people. But no one knew for sure. The last member of the team was one of twin brothers, with a unique jutsu that let them share thoughts and memories, even their senses, across the hundreds of miles between them. He was a spy, not on Konoha, but on this team, keeping the Raikage updated through his brother on exactly what was going on here. I shook his head. The man's personality was so arrogant and superior, you'd have thought him an Uchiha by the way he carried himself. If he knew a way to do it without getting caught, Kokura Ichiro would have had an accident long ago. And how exactly were they supposed to assassinate the Konoha Jinchuriki if they didn't know who it was? Otome looked around. This was her team, then, at least for now. She bowed to the others. My name is Uzumaki Otome, she said. I am new to Konoha, so please, excuse any ignorance I display. The blonde girl beside the larger boy nodded. You're Naruto's cousin, aren't you? I'm Yamanaka Ino, and this is Akamichi Choji. Our sensei is Sodaitora Shinshi. He said he'd be here later, and to show you where and how we train. The night before their wedding, Naruto did not have nightmares. Instead, he and his beloved Hinata spent their separate time holding a sort of vigil, a period of contemplation on what life would be bringing them as well as how they got this far. Forced by circumstance to grow up far too fast, the young shinobi stared meditatively into the flame of a candle, watching as it burned. It felt oddly refreshing when he realized that he'd spent the entire night awake. He'd found question after question, doubts had risen, and fears had been found, and he'd looked carefully at each. The answers he came up with were his own, and he dressed the next morning in the formal kimono he'd purchased with the assistance of Neji and Hinata. The black wide-legged trousers, and the black kimono with orange trim and the white spiral of uzumaki on each shoulder, beneath the white haori, or sleeveless coat, that bore the red spirals on the back and over the heart, and the clan's new emblem, an orange spiral, on the obi about his waist, were striking and suited him well. As he strode past the guests, including the newest members of his clan and a few others such as Kakashi, Jiraiya and Iruka, Naruto was nervous. No, terrified, that Hinata would for some reason change her mind. But when her father led her into the room, all Naruto's thoughts disappeared like snow in an active volcano. The bride wore the traditional formal kimono, pure white, with a cloth over her head like a hood, and pale makeup, and the traditional tanto, intended to represent the severing of ties with her old family. The thin line of red silk, showing at the edges, was a second kimono, meant to be revealed after the ceremony was concluded, a sort of rebirth, a new life for the bride. For the white kimono bore the emblems of the Hyuga, while the red would have the Uzumaki spirals. The second she saw him, their eyes met, and other than each other's faces, the rest of the ceremony was a blur, although they must have been paying enough attention to get by, making the right responses in the right places, and before they'd realized it, the white kimono was removed and Tsunade-sama, in her office as Hokage, was declaring them wed, and granting them permission to kiss. They were both so focused on each other. When the time came for them to go to bed, they found that Kurenai's futon had been moved. They'd known that it would be, but it still came as a shock of sorts, that their sensei didn't believe they needed a chaperone anymore. The two made their way across the bedroom, dropping a garment every few feet, until they were in the bed, kissing with a passion they'd not realized they'd been waiting for, and shut off the lights as they fell into each other's embrace. Outside Konoha, on a hill overlooking the gates, two men in black cloaks embroidered with red clouds waited for dawn, when the gates would open again. They had seen the fireworks of some celebration. The Chunin exams had been 2 weeks gone, so still celebrating that was unlikely, and had decided to wait until morning. Hungover shinobi were, after all, easier to deal with. Naruto and his new bride made their appearance at the Hokage Tower to register the final paperwork for their marriage. Hinata's change of address forms. The celebrations the previous night had apparently not been confined to the Hyuga estate, so many of the shinobi, and more than a few civilians, were a little hungover. The terrors of bureaucracy vanquished for now, the happy couple decided to see what their fellow rookies had gotten up to. So where to first? Naruto asked. Knowing they'd be in demand, the newlyweds had chosen not to take a honeymoon, but to be available if the Hokage needed them. Now he made the same decision as many wise husbands through the ages. The opinion of your wife matters. Shino will be helping his family with their hives and unattached Kakaichu colonies. I think his little sister Shikibu is supposed to be getting her first colony in about a month or so he'll be busy today. Ino was going to visit Sakura, and probably train with her. Hinata's decision was a long time in coming. Kiba? Naruto shook his head. Nah, it's Friday, and he's not on a mission, so he has to clean the Inuzuka dog runs today. He cleans himself well, but I can smell it. What about Shikamaru? It was Hinata's turn to shoot down an idea. He did have a mission today. Apparently he's the ambassador Hokage-sama is sending to Suna, to keep an eye on the treaty. It seems they still haven't chosen a Godem Kazekage yet, too many factions, and Tsunade-sama is hoping he can find the one best suited to the job. As they wandered down the street, they found themselves in front of the academy, where the students, including Konohamaru and his friends Moegi and Udon as well as Hanabi, although she was on the opposite side of the group from the others, were setting in to spar with each other. There was a moment that the ninja cadets smiled to see the newest, and arguably most famous Chunin in the village, before their gazes were drawn to someone or something behind the couple. Reacting on instinct, Naruto ducked, even as Hinata jumped upward, to balance for a moment on Naruto's hand, thrust into the air in the wake of whatever had nearly taken his head off. At least as far as most people could see. There in the middle of the street were two men in black cloaks covered with red clouds. The one on the right was taller, and held what looked like it should have been a two-handed sword, although as covered in bandages as it was hard to be certain, in one hand. The man himself was strange, no other word fit. The black sclera of his eyes, contrasted against the golden iris and the dead-looking pupil, the blue hue to his skin, the gill-like marks on his face. Everything about this man screamed, killer. No, not killer. Naruto and Hinata knew they could kill if they had to. This man was the type of psychopath who would cut you just to see you bleed, and to hell with whatever another thought of this. The other man's face was obscured beneath his wide-brimmed hat, but there was an air about him that said, dangerous, a capacity not just to kill, but to make it last until the victim was begging for it. Uzumaki Naruto, he said in a dead voice, you will be coming with us, or we will kill your friend here, and then those children, one by one, while you won't be able to stop us. Naruto snorted as he and Hinata took fighting stances, and various other people in the streets shook their heads as these two strangers apparently appeared from nowhere. As the civilians backed away, and the academy teachers hurried to move the cadets back into the academy building, the shorter of the two reached for his hat. Remember Kisame, the leader wants him alive, and we don't have much time before they come for us. The shark-featured man grinned, his teeth all jagged, like a row of broken bottles. Don't worry, I don't think taking off his legs so he can't run is going to kill him, he retorted. There was a pounding on the door of Tsunade's rooms, and the Hokage was jerked into sudden, painful awareness. The bottle before her was once full of prime-quality shochu, Sake's stronger cousin, and now it was not. That would certainly explain the hammering. As she noticed Jiraiya slowly lifting his head from the couch opposite her, the Godem Hokage realized that the pounding was not just in her head, and struggled to her feet and stumbled towards the door, even as her old friend made his way to the kitchen to make coffee. Yanking the door open, she glared at the terrified Chunin outside. What is it? I warn you, if it's not important, I'll have you busted back to the academy so fast. Hokage-sama, the ninja interrupted, voice filled with panic. Uchiha Itachi and Hoshigaki Kisame. They're here in Konoha, outside the academy. I think they're after the Uzumaki couple. His report delivered, the ninja braced for the reaction, even as Jiraiya dropped the coffee cups on the way out the window, with the Hokage shouting orders back over her shoulder as she followed. Get all available Jonin on capture crews, and call out Hunter Nin in case we aren't in time. I want all Anbu to drop what they're doing, whatever it is, and assemble for interception. And let the hospital know we'll need more beds. I don't suppose you'd let us take this somewhere you can't threaten innocent bystanders? Naruto said to the shark-like man before him. Even as his wife, he couldn't get enough of calling Hinata that, moved to intercept the other missing nin. Kisami's answer was another swing of the massive sword. Naruto assumed that was what was under the bandages, based on how Kisame was wielding it. Sidestepping as the weapon came down wasn't much help, as the blade moved, twisting its shape to strike him anyway. Naruto reacted by pouring a measure of chakra into his bones, bringing the bone metal plating to his shoulder just in time to catch the blow, which drove him to his knees, even as he brought out his claws. The sudden extension of his bone metal widened his opponent's eyes as the sword hit, and the claws had the man leaping back to avoid the slash that came with them. Okay, that's something new, the missing nin muttered. Hey, Itachi, I think your agents are slipping, they didn't tell us about this. He swept the blade again, this time aiming for soft tissue. No one could say he wasn't a fast learner, and as the sword called Samahata swept across, aimed at the Kyuubi Jinchuriki's abdomen, Naruto caught the blade on his crossed claws, even as he pushed wind and lightning chakra into them. Arashi no Sume, the younger shinobi yelled. Claws of the storm. The technique's been effective on oversized swords before, the fresh minted Chunin thought. Why mess with a winning combination? You have bitten off more than you can chew, girl, the renegade Uchiha stated. It is unfortunate, but I will have to finish this before we can be interrupted. But that doesn't mean I can't take my time with this. Guessing he was about to use a genjutsu, Hinata threw her chakra into her Byakugan, watching, not the physical world, but the chakra flows, even as Itachi spoke the name of his dreaded technique. Tsukiyomi. The world was an illusion, a vast and complex construct, and despite the obvious distortions, she was trapped in it. Itachi couldn't help but lecture her. The Byakugan is a most wonderful tool for piercing deception, he said as he stepped up to the girl chained to a cross, with an unsheathed katana in his hand. This is going to hurt, and you will die, eventually. You can do nothing here, for all that you have the Byakugan, to the Mangekyo Sharingan, it is just another way to seize control of your senses. And when we are done here, I will leave your corpse lying in the street, and we will extract the Kyuubi from your little boyfriend, and he will join you, in death. And still, you can do nothing about it. Hinata forced her attention away from his voice. She instead focused on Kurenai-sensei's lectures about genjutsu, and what little the Jonin had said about the Sharingan's illusions. The Byakugan let her see the chakra flow, and she was in a lucid state, with some control of the shifts, or she would be unable to feel the pain that Itachi obviously wanted her to. If he'd had that much control of the illusory world, he'd not have bound her. She felt the katana enter her chest, piercing her breast slowly as it was forced through her heart. Then suddenly it was gone. Itachi spoke again. This genjutsu's subjective time will last 72 hours, 3 days, he said. That was 1 minute. Now, he again raised his katana. Hinata was so close to breaking this. Naruto was obviously fighting out there, he was fighting for her, and she would fight for him, for their future. A soft pulse of chakra washed through her belly as she thought of that future, of their children as yet unborn, or even conceived. For them, the sons and daughters for her Naru-kun to teach and spoil, she would not let this criminal defeat her. She couldn't move her hands to form hand seals, so she'd have to do this without them. In the real world, this would be impossible, since she didn't have the necessary chakra reserves, and likely wouldn't for years, or even decades, if ever. But, here, in a world that was pure illusion and chakra that was just begging to be shaped, Kisame jumped backwards, landing on the fence across from the academy, staring at the bleeding wound in his sword, pouring out the liquefied chakra onto the ground, where it hissed and steamed away. Looking over, he could see where Samahata had made contact with the boy's arm, flaying it to the bone. Metallic bone at that, but even as he watched, the injury was closing, healing over and filling out beneath the crusted blood. It obviously hurt, but it just as obviously wouldn't slow the boy down for long. He'd need an edge, and his eyes lit on the children in the academy yard, even as they were being ushered inside, and he saw one girl, looking quite like the one Itachi had trapped in his genjutsu. He'd have threatened her, she was obviously important to him, but he was between them now. Kisame sprang into motion, leaping the fence in a single bound, and driving the teacher with the scar on his face back with Samahata's hilt as he reached for the girl. He didn't expect the boy, a scarf-wearing brat who hadn't even received his Hite 8, racing between them and driving a kunai into the outstretched arm. With Kisame's experience, it wasn't a serious wound, and he pulled back the arm in time to avoid it becoming any more serious, as he thrust across with Samahata, a glancing blow at best that shredded the brat's shirt and made his chest look like someone had used it to go sledding on gravel. The killing intent that exploded behind him froze him to the spot, even as the girl was screaming her classmate's name. Or was it the village's name? Kisame had other things to worry about as he forced himself to look back at the boy, little more than a child, this menacing presence came from. That was a mistake, snarled Uzumaki Naruto. Itachi was vaguely interested in this child's maneuver, even if it was futile, he would let her try, and when she failed, well, he would have to punish the attempt, but he would respect her while he did. Hinata focused her lucid mind on the patterns she'd seen Naruto utilize a handful of times, and struggled with it. The first step, rotation, was easy enough, and the second step, power, was easy to obtain here, she simply took it from the genjutsu around them. The third and final step was control, something that any half-trained Hyuga had in spades, and at least one Uzumaki, now. The chains on her arms and wrists shattered as the impossible blue spheres appeared in her hands, tearing away at the solidity of the nightmare. As she dropped to her feet and the sword, or rather the image of a sword was raised, she concentrated on the very real feelings of the night before, and the inevitable future where she would be nursing her children and would not let go, screaming out as she launched her illusory assault, making up the name on the spot. Uzumaki Hidden Technique. Rasen Nento, Spiral Mind. The spiraling spheres were as illusory as the rest of the Sharingan enforced genjutsu, and that was precisely the problem. By placing himself in the genjutsu, Itachi had rendered himself vulnerable in a way he'd never imagined. As the twisting rotating energy of an attack he'd never believed to be passed on stripped away the substance of the illusion, and as Hinata drove these balls of spiraling energy into the face of her captor, all the power of Itachi's own genjutsu was forced to feed back into his own Sharingan. Jiraiya heard the screams of agony and pain as he landed, and saw Hinata collapse to her knees, and thought he'd arrived too late, until he saw Itachi Uchiha clutching at the ruins of his eyes as they exploded outwards across his face. A quick glance toward Naruto saw him driving Hoshigaki Kisame back into a corner, his sword damaged badly, and with wounds here and there, while Naruto's own injuries barely lasted seconds. As the newly made Chunin maneuvered his foe into a position with no one behind him, the Toad Sage saw the body of Sarutobi Konohamaru lying on the ground in front of a shocked and silent Hyuga Hanabi. No, not silent, she was whispering the boy's name over and over. Pointing, knowing Tsunade was right behind him, he moved to cut off the escape of these missing nin. Naruto was enraged by this stranger's attack on Konohamaru, and his attempt to take Naruto's new sister-in-law hostage was, to the Uzumaki credo he was assembling, unforgivable. He reached out mentally as he kept up the assault, to the one deep inside him. Kyubi no Yoko, I don't have your name, but I ask for a little of your chakra. He sent the message direct, mind to mind, and the Kyubi paused. These strangers came to our home, and threatened us, so we fought, and they threatened the children of the village, and I need to stop this one before he hurts another child, ever again. The one he hurt is a friend, a little brother in type if not blood. Better be ready, Kit, the Kyubi said as he extended a little more chakra through the seal. This is going to hurt, and by the way, you who fights for the younglings, the kits of your people. My name is Kurama. Naruto didn't have time to respond to that, as the flow of chakra, of Yuki, into his body did indeed hurt, as if a full-body gravel rash were dipped in salt water, and he was forced to concentrate to channel this chakra to where he needed it. The flare of red chakra over Naruto's body was not missed by any of the arriving shinobi. All the rookies saw it, as did their senseis. The killing intent Naruto had been pouring out intensified, although somehow, there was an inhumanly precise control to it, as Tsunade, Hanabi and Konohamaru didn't feel so much as a nervous flutter. Nor did Hinata, but that was because she knew, on a level so deep it was impossible to shake, that Naruto was this scary to those who threatened his precious ones. The red aura condensed, melding with his own blue chakra into a vibrant purple color, and this energy was channeled into the spiraling orb of the Rasengan as he struck forward with his left claws as he forced the barely contained purple orb into the claws on his right, and he drove them forwards as Kisame brought up Samahata to block, roaring out as he did. Rasenjutsu, Uzumaki no Sume, Demon Strike. Samahata held up for a few seconds before the spiraling, wild energy of the chakra-enhanced claws tore away at the blade, drilling a massive hole in it that had 3 ridges to it, top and bottom. The burst of spiraling chakra then continued outwards through the body behind the sword, leaving a similar if somewhat larger hole through Kisami's chest, and grinding 3 gouges from the sparring field, across the street and through the wall on the far side. The sheer energy released was staggering, and even Jiraiya was struck mute by the event. Turning, his claws retracting into his arms with a hiss of heated metal, Naruto's eyes sought out Hinata, and even as shell-shocked Anbu took the renegade Uchiha into custody, weighing him down with chakra restraints, Naruto walked a little unsteadily to his Hinataheim and embraced her, as the two nearly collapsed against a nearby wall. Konohamaru was delivered quickly to the hospital where trainee medic Nin would regenerate the skin on his chest, while Hanabi ran to her sister and hugged her, crying aloud now. The Hokage looked around at the damage, Kisami's body, and the Anbu dragging away their prisoner. This was going to be Jigoku's own paperwork. Ai's right eye was developing a noticeable twitch as he looked through the binoculars at the scene of that fight. The chakra-powered devices that he and his team carried had allowed them to witness the fight as if from a nearby rooftop, while actually standing in the park above the Hokage monument. A low whistle caught his attention. "Yo, bro, I think we know where they Jinchuriki's at, but I ain't willin' to fight the brat." B's rap struck a more annoying nerve than usual, but for once, Yugito didn't call him on it, instead speaking the older Jinchuriki's lingo. Word, she peeled her eyes from her own binoculars, turning to the third Chunin. Ichiro had a look of concentration on his face as he relayed the information to his brother Nijiro. Then he paled. "Raikage says not to abort," he said, "and we can't let Konoha keep such an asset. Secondaries are targets of opportunity, primary is essential. Nijiro says screw that for a game of soldiers, he wants to live." At the blank looks on his team's faces, he sighed. "A major drawback of our family jutsu is how closely it links our life forces. One dies, both do. I don't like the thought that I'm expendable, and neither does he." I was assessing the situation and picking out what details he could, before turning away from Konoha. Initial reconnaissance has raised questions as to the quality of current intelligence assets. Several problems have been raised in regards to Target's current abilities. Said Target and his teammate have both recently made Chunin, and although they were almost certainly underestimated by their opponents, they did take down 2S rank missing Nin. In my opinion as team leader, this requires we withdraw, acquire further intelligence and then revisit the plans to eliminate a threat to Kumogakure. Ichiro was busy relaying Ai's report, so he missed the look that passed between B and Yugito as I said this. They nodded to each other and then to Ai. They were with him. They had noticed, even if Ichiro, new to the field, hadn't, that their leader hadn't specified the exact threat he was thinking of. Sasuke stared at his brother as the Anbu carried him away, feeling the curse mark nudging at his desire for revenge, trying to amplify it to the point that he would act madly for the power. But Itachi had just had his eyes blown out by a Hyuga, somehow, and from the way he screamed at the time, the injury of that far outweighed the physical loss. He beat back the urge to take out a kunai and attack his brother, with the thought that he'd let him marinate in his own misery for a while. He almost missed Kakashi-sensei's presence until the one-eyed Jonin spoke. "Sasuke, perhaps you should look at it like this," Kakashi said as his student trembled with rage and bloodlust. "Perhaps the best form of revenge you can get on Itachi is to render him irrelevant. To say, you have had no effect on me, and you aren't worth enough of my attention to scrape you off my shoe." "I hadn't thought of it like that, sensei," the young Uchiha said. Sakura felt a shiver of fear running down her spine as she looked at Naruto, and then to the damage he'd done. It was terrifying to think that she had once been willing to antagonize someone who could do that. It was a good thing Naruto didn't hold a grudge or she would really have something to be scared of. She peered through the gashes in the wall across from the academy's sparring field. The gouges had continued through here, for another 5 feet, ruining half of a backyard picnic table, and she again looked over at Naruto, who was nestled in Hinata's arms as much as the other way around. And she goes to bed with him, she thought, wondering how it came to pass that the shyest girl in their year had become the gutsiest kunoichi. Otome looked up as her father entered the yard which their house shared with Naruto's. His face was grim. "2 of the Akatsuki arrived today," he said with a dour tone to his gravelly voice. They were apparently here for Naruto-sama. As she placed her hands over her mouth, the red-haired girl went white, literally. She'd raised her keke genkai and was standing as she did, ready to go to war to bring back her cousin, but her father's raised hand stopped her, as he continued speaking. "It was Uchiha and Hoshigaki, Otome-chan, neither of us would have stood a chance. Before you go to raise an army, it's fine. Naruto-sama and Hinata-sama are already back under their own roof." Otome breathed a sigh of relief as her skin of stone retreated. So the Anbu arrived in time, or the Hokage herself, and Jiraiya-sama. Ishiguma shook his head. They did manage a timely arrival, but by the time they did, it was all over. He paused, savoring the puzzled look on her face, then the widening of her eyes as she realized exactly what that meant. Hi, Otome-chan, Naruto-sama and Hinata-sama stopped the top pair of the Akatsuki unaided. It makes me very proud of my new clan. Otome nodded as she collapsed back into the seat. If her cousin was that strong, she was a very lucky kunoichi. The messenger was lying on Orochimaru's floor, rapidly cooling, and the man, if the term could be accurately applied, was currently destroying things in a towering rage. He'd never been able to defeat Uchiha Itachi, and here some half-grown girl not only beat him, but destroyed his eyes doing it. As he threw another glass jar, filled with some body parts harvested from his experiments, scattering the formaldehyde-soaked organs across the room, he began to calm. He'd been doing this for the past 5 minutes, and all it was getting him was fewer research materials. As he sat on his throne, he recalled the circumstances of his own leaving the group that had just lost its 2 best members. Perhaps he could convince them of a mutual benefit? A shared goal? This would need finesse. Itachi woke, but his eyes wouldn't open, and he heard a familiar voice. "I've been hoping to have a little chat with you, Uchiha Itachi," said Morino Ibiki. "There are 3 ways this can go: the easy way, which is very easy, the hard way, which is less so. And then there's my way."